through another article which is related to SOQL best practices in the Salesforce. So let's read through this article, right, and let's see if we agree with that or not. So when we're dealing with a large data in our SOQL queries, they could return so many objects that the limit on the heap size is exceeded and an error occurs. In this post, we will work through Apex SOQL best practices in Salesforce and how it's important for us when we're dealing with large data sets. We will also see how Lightning Platform Query Optimizer works for LDV. Alright, so let's go and let's get started. So first point, it's related to building efficient and selective SOQL queries. So for the best performance, SOQL queries must be selective. You may receive an error message when a non-selective query is triggered, executes against an object that contains more than 100 or 1000 of rows. To avoid this error, ensure that the query is selective. A query is selective when one of the query filters is on an indexed field and the query filter reduces the resulting number of rows below a system-defined threshold. For all standards and custom fields, certain fields are automatically flagged as indexed. Those fields included into the following. So it will be actually, guys, let's say any kind of IDs, fields marked as unique, external, any kind of master detail relationship, record type, of course, create a date, mod stamp, owner ID, and okay, it looks like name as well. So all these fields are marked by default as indexed. And sometimes what you see, guys, that you need to have some additional fields as indexed, and it looks like it's also possible for you to raise a case with the Salesforce for them to actually give you possibility to create custom indexes. So let's see what is else covered here. Anytime you use one of the about indexed fields in your queries where closure, you will increase in the change that your query is considered selective and the index used as opposite to a full table scan. Salesforce.com supports can add custom indexes on request for customers. Okay, got it. So also we will take a look, down in that article if you have it or not, right? But if you guys know what is, like skinny tables or not. Let's say when Salesforce actually store all of our fields, right, which is represented for us in our organization as, like some table with some fields, right, it's actually on the Salesforce, let's say behind of the scene, right, it's represented in two tables. So they store fields, like in two different tables. One table contains custom fields, another table contains standard fields, right? And each time when you do in some kind of SOQL query, what is happening is they actually grabbing fields from one, like table, grabbing fields from another table, and then they're trying to perform, let's say, their queries, in order to get you the relevant data. And sometimes, like to make sure that your SOQL query working, like as fast as possible, it will be great to use skin tables. Like, for example, your request in Salesforce that, for example, we have to do many times, that specific SOQL query where we are combining, for example, some standard fields and some custom fields right into the one, let's say, table. So then, like they're doing that table for you, and then your queries against, like that specific, against the specific tables, right, that you just asked them, to provide will work faster. And let's see if it will be actually handled here, like in terms of the SOQL queries, right? But for you to understand, of course, that issue is happening, right, and that really, like the error becoming really throwing up, right, and that's why it will be good to use this indexed fields. Common causes of not selective SOQL queries. Using an indexed field in your query does not always make it golden. There is several factors that can prevent your SOQL queries from being selective. When building your queries, always strive to avoid these things. Querying for null rows. Queries that looks for a record in which the field is empty or null. For example, here we have our SOQL query, right? And what it's looking for all of kind of fields where we have some field equal to null. All right. So then when we have a negative filters, So that means that when we're using negative filters, like give me everything where status is not equal to closed, right? So that means that, like it still should scan the entire table, right? And find like all these records where, like something else is mentioned here, right? But if you will, like for example, to convert something, like set SOQL query into something different, let's say give me records where I have my status open or in progress, so that it will work, let's say, much faster in terms of the SOQL query. All right, next one, it's leading wildcards. A like condition with a leading wildcard does not use an index such as this. Select ID last name from contact where last name like this. Alright, understand. Text fields with a comparison operators, using comparison operators such greater, less, or others. Yeah, so I think idea of it, like again, like in that when our SOQL query will work, right, it will need to compare, like all these values where we have in the field, right, with a specific value. So that's why I think they mention it here. So next point is related to Query Optimizer. Developer Console contains a neat little tool to speed up your queries and give you a behind-the-scene peek into how the Query Optimizer works. The Query Plan tool is not enabled by default. Enable it by doing the following. From Setup, select your name, Developer Console to open Developer Console. So then go to the Help Preferences and then click Enable Query Plan and make sure that it's set to true. Click Save. In the Query Editor tab, confirms that the Query Plan button is now next to Execute button. Yeah, so that is, like let's say hidden by default tool in the Salesforce, and if you would like to enable this Query Optimizer, you could do it based on the steps provided here. So next one point is what we have here, it's avoiding querying on formula fields. So avoiding filtering with a formula field that contains dynamic, not deterministic references. By default, formula fields does not have underlying indexes, so they are required full scan to find target records. Since in the winter release you have been able to contact Salesforce customer support to create a custom index on formula field provided that the function that defines the formulas fields is deterministic, but here an example of common not deterministic formulas for .com cannot index field Z. Reference other entities, like for example fields accessible through the lookup. Include other formula fields that span over other entries. Use a dynamic date, like date and time function, today and now. Alright. So next one, it's custom indexes containing null rows. You can connect with the Salesforce, customer support to create a custom indexes that include null rows, even if you already have a custom index on your custom fields. They need to be explicitly enabled and rebuilt to get the empty values rows into the index tables. Note that this option does not apply to pick list, external IDs, and foreign keys fields. If you need to query a null external ID field, you can work with the Salesforce.com customer support to create a two-column compound index instead. Yeah, so why it's created? So each time when we, let's say, using indexed fields, our general idea is for that index field to actually represent our records, right? When we are looking through that field, you should be understand that this record is, like exactly what we want. And sometimes, like we are only one field that, let's say, representation is not enough, right, for us to get it. So that's why sometimes we could, as how it mentioned here, work with the Salesforce support and ask them, to create some index which will contain a couple of fields, like for example, two-column field or a compound indexed, like instead of regular. So next one is related to delete records from recycle bins. Don't forget about deleting records in your recycle bin. Did you know that deleted records can affect your query performance? There is two ways to resolve it. So add is deleted to false into your query or empty recycle bin. So I think that, in my practice I was not able to see that guys really, let's say, often use this, right? Or somebody cleaning recycle bin or doing something like this. Of course, it's, like mentioned that potentially SOQL query could get these records, deleted from JDB, but actually I was not able, to really see that everyone adding, like always something like this into their SOQL queries. All right. There are difference between system mod stamp and last modified day that go beyond just being to separate system fields. Yeah, it's because like system mod stamp is indexed, right? And last modified date is sort of not indexed. So when you guys doing any kind of SQL queries, right, it's better to use system mod stamp, right? And let us read through the description. Last modified date is automatically updated whenever a user creates or updates the records. Last modified date can be imported with any backdated value in your business required, preventing original timestamps. So system mod stamp time is strictly read-only. Not only is it updated when a user updates the record, but also when an automated system process updates the record. Because of this behavior, it's created difference in a stored value where last modified date less than system mod stamp, but never last modified date bigger than system mod stamp. All right. So next one is related to SOQL injection. Avoid using dynamic SOQL where it's possible. Instead, use static queries and bind the values. If you must use dynamic queries, use escape single quote method to sanitize users supplied input. Yeah, so regarding to this, I think there are a separate article, but idea behind it's in the following. So each time when you're doing your SQL query, right, and sometimes you're doing it dynamic to make sure that it could automatically put any kind of object and all this stuff. So please don't forget that like if you're getting any kind of, let's say, customer input and you are passing this customer input directly into the SQL query to escape it, because potentially what let's say hackers could do, let's imagine that you have some table, right, that should show you some kind of data. Prior to it, you have some search field. So when you put in some information into that search field and then immediately like to add it into the SQL query, right, which should return data for this data table. So what they could do is they could include like this additional single quotes plus like some JavaScript and plus like it's a basic let's say piece of SOQL query. And in that case, what will happen, right? So that JavaScript code will also execute it on the page, right? Or for example, some additional data will be grabbed from the SOQL query, and you actually don't want all of this stuff to be happening, right? So that's why when we using this escape single quote, so what it's do, it's actually will really remove single quotes, right, from that piece of text that you're passing from the customer. Also, there are sometimes different kind of techniques, like for example, blacklisting, whitelisting against of the list of the specific items that you define it in your policies, but like it's topic of the separate discussion, not related to just SOQL. So next item is related to SOQL versus SOQL. So using the most appropriate language, SOQL or SOQL, for a given search. Like for example, when we have a SOQL, we're using query to call the data beta. When we're using SOQL, we're using search on search indexes. You see what is the difference, right? And SOQL use when we know which objects and fields the data, like resides, and we could use a search, right, when we are looking through the different kind of objects, for example, or through the different kind of fields, right, and in let's say all of them we actually would like to find some specific records. And because those two different techniques are actually different, right, there is also different the amount of records which let's say they could return. So for example, let us read: for each Apex transaction, the government limits for SOQL queries is 2,000. For SOQL queries, it's about 50,000. So if you need to retrieve more than 2,000 of records, SOQL is better choice, right? But it's really, depend on the way how you're using. So I remember that in the past there was very interesting case when it was required for us to find, different names on different languages, right, of persons through the Salesforce database. And like when there was some specific, let's say, to the specific location symbols in the name of the person, so we were able to grab them via SOQL, right, but we were not able to grab them via SOQL. But it was like maybe 5 years ago or something like this. So there are definitely not just in terms of the number of let's say difference, not just in terms of the number of records returned, right, but also in terms of the way how they works, right, as how it's mentioned, it's working based on a couple of objects, based on a couple of fields, right, but it's also could not work based on some long text areas and some other stuff. So there are definitely differences. Avoiding SOQL inside of for loop. So I think it's related to some another discussions that we did today, also related to Apex best practices. And I think, like in terms of the very, very basics related to SOQL queries, we discussed it, right? But in terms of the possibility for us to work, like with large data in the Salesforce, right? Of course, it will be great to read through another articles, right? Which will actually represent, like what is the problem behind of it. Because like there are when we're working with big amount of data, it's related like the possibility how we could actually build our reports and dashboards, how like our SQL queries will be impacted, how our list views will be structured, right? What is kind of like ownership skews we could potentially get when we have like for example one owner for the tons of records, and we will need to recalculate sharings, or for example change the owner of some of those records, like for example record login, right? When for example we have our account, right, and we updating related to it contacts, sharing of calculation of sharings, right? So all this stuff, like it's actually part of like separate discussion, right? As well as skinny tables, but our idea, like in that item was to cover basics related to SOQLs, right? And if you guys will be interested, you could also go through this, like article which is related to what kind of techniques we should apply when we are working with a large amount of data in the Salesforce, and what is kind of like techniques we could actually use, like for example also data loss strategy, right, or strategy for archiving data after it. So it will be a part of just separate discussion. So at this moment, thank you guys for the attentions.